Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of D.B. Cooper. But before the legend, before the jump, there was simply a man standing in the rain. Let us go back to where it began. The date is November 24th, 1971. It is the afternoon before Thanksgiving, and the sky over Portland, Oregon, is a heavy, bruising shade of gray. A persistent, chilly rain falls over the Pacific Northwest, slicking the tarmac of the Portland International Airport and blurring the lights of the terminal through the mist. The air outside is cold, damp, and smells of wet asphalt and pine needles, typical for an Oregon autumn. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere is thick with the frenetic energy of the holiday rush. Families embrace near the gates. Businessmen check their watches, and the low hum of conversation mixes with the rhythmic clatter of mechanical flight boards flipping through destinations. Yet amidst this sea of movement, one figure moves with a slow, deliberate calm. He is a ghost in the crowd, unnoticed, unhurried, and utterly ordinary. The man appears to be in his mid-40s. He is dressed in a dark suit, perhaps black or a deep russet brown, tailored to fit a frame that is neither imposing nor slight. Over the suit, he wears a lightweight black raincoat, damp from the weather outside. His shoes are dark loafers, polished but sensible. He looks like any other executive traveling for work, blending seamlessly into the tapestry of 1971. But if you were to look closer, you might notice the details. A white pressed shirt, a thin black necktie, clip-on style, anchored by a tie clip with a mother-of-pearl setting that catches the fluorescent overhead lights. In his hand, he carries a black attaché case. It is sleek, hard-sided, and heavy with secrets. On his face, he wears dark sunglasses, shielding his eyes from the glare or perhaps from being remembered. He approaches the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter. The linoleum floor squeaks faintly beneath his loafers as he steps up to the desk. The agent behind the counter is busy, her mind likely on the holiday schedule, the delays, the weather. The man speaks in a voice that is low and polite. He does not offer a reason for his travel, nor does he provide identification, for in 1971, the skies are open and trusting. Security checkpoints are non-existent, metal detectors are a thing of the future. He simply requests a one-way ticket to Seattle. The agent types out the request. The flight is Northwest Orient Flight 305, a Boeing 727, scheduled for a short 30-minute hop north. The man reaches into his pocket and withdraws a $20 bill. He pays in cash. The total fare is exactly $20. He gives the name Dan Cooper. Ticket in hand, Dan Cooper turns and walks toward the gate. He moves with a fluid, easy grace, the black raincoat billowing slightly around his legs. He boards the aircraft, a trijet known for its reliability and its rear ventral staircase, a detail that will soon matter a great deal, but for now is just a part of the architecture. The plane is only about one-third full, a hollow metal tube echoing with the shuffling of passengers settling in. He makes his way to the rear of the cabin, the noise of the terminal fading behind him, replaced by the high-pitched whine of the auxiliary power unit. He finds his row 18. He chooses seat 18E, a seat in the middle, though with the light capacity he has room to breathe. The upholstery is patterned, rough to the touch, smelling faintly of stale smoke and fabric cleaner. He settles into the cushion, placing the black attaché case on the floor, or perhaps on the seat beside him. A flight attendant named Florence Schaffner, young and attentive, moves through the cabin, preparing for departure. Cooper catches her attention. He is calm, polite, not menacing in the least. He orders a drink, a bourbon and soda. As he waits, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a pack of cigarettes. He lights one, the flame of the lighter flaring briefly, illuminating the dark lenses of his glasses. He inhales deeply, the smoke curling upward into the stagnant cabin air, mingling with the scent of rain-soaked wool. He takes the drink when it arrives, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He sips the bourbon, watching the rain streak horizontally across the small oval window as the engines begin to scream to life. The plane pushes back. The wheels bump over the expansion joints of the taxiway. Dan Cooper is on his way to nowhere. The Boeing 727 climbs through the gray, waterlogged clouds above Portland, its engines humming a low, steady baritone that vibrates through the floorboards. Inside the cabin, the air is thick and warm, recycled and laced with the scent of tobacco. In 1971, the haze of cigarette smoke is a constant companion to air travel, swirling in the beams of the reading lights like suspended dust. In the very last row, the man in the dark suit sits in the middle seat. He is quiet, composed, a shadow against the beige interior. He reaches for the call button, his movement slow and deliberate. When the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, approaches, he orders a drink. His voice is polite, lacking any edge of nervousness. He asks for a bourbon and 7-Up. He pays with a $20 bill, waving away the change. He lights a Raleigh cigarette, the flame of the match flaring briefly before settling into an orange ember. He exhales a long, thin stream of smoke, watching it dissipate into the cabin air, his dark sunglasses reflecting nothing but the interior of the plane. Florence moves through the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone who has flown this route 100 times. The tray tables rattle slightly. The hum of conversation from the other passengers is a dull murmur, a backdrop of normalcy. As she passes the rear row again, the man leans forward slightly. He does not grab her, he simply extends a hand. In his fingers, he holds a folded piece of white paper. It is a small gesture, easily missed. Florence takes it instinctively, her mind already categorizing the interaction. It is a common occurrence for a flight attendant to receive notes from lonely businessmen, phone numbers, addresses, clumsy attempts at flirtation scribbled on napkins or notebook paper. She does not look at it. She does not unfold it. She simply slips the paper into her purse, her movements automatic, dismissing the man and his note as just another mundane detail of the job. She turns to walk away, intending to return to her jump seat, to the safety of routine. But the man is not finished. He does not let her walk away. He leans closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that cuts through the drone of the jet engines. He speaks clearly, ensuring only she can hear. "Miss," he says, "you had better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words hang in the space between them, heavy and impossible. Florence stops. The air in the cabin seems to freeze. She turns back to him, searching his face for a sign of a joke, a drunken prank, anything that would allow her to laugh this off. But his expression is unreadable behind the dark glasses. He is perfectly calm. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she retrieves the note from her purse. She unfolds the paper. The ink is neat, printed in all capital letters with a felt-tip pen. It confirms what he has just spoken. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me." She sits. The cushion of the empty seat beside him compresses under her weight. She is close enough to smell the bourbon on his breath and the stale smoke on his suit. She asks, quietly, to see it. She needs to know if this nightmare is real. The man places his black attaché case on his lap. He undoes the latches with a sharp, metallic click that sounds too loud in the quiet rear of the plane. He lifts the lid. Inside, there is no paperwork, no business files. Instead, the case is filled with a chaotic yet purposeful arrangement of machinery. Florence stares down at 8 red cylinders, 4 stacked on top of 4. They look like road flares, bright and warning-colored against the dark lining of the case. Beside them lies a large cylindrical battery. Wires, insulated in red, snake between the components, connecting the cylinders to the battery in a lethal circuit. It is crude, undeniable, and terrifying. He closes the case gently, hiding the red cylinders from view, sealing the threat back into the nondescript luggage. Now he dictates his terms. He does not shout. He does not wave a weapon. He speaks like a man ordering dinner in a quiet restaurant. He tells her exactly what he wants. He demands $200,000 in negotiable American currency. He specifies the bills must be $20 bills. He demands 4 parachutes, 2 back parachutes and 2 chest parachutes. He tells her that when they land in Seattle, he wants a fuel truck ready to refuel the plane immediately. No funny stuff, he warns, or he will do the job. Florence writes it all down, her pen moving shakily across the paper. She stands up, her legs feeling heavy and numb. She must walk the length of the aisle, past the rows of unsuspecting passengers who are reading magazines and smoking cigarettes, unaware that a bomb sits just a few feet behind them. She clutches the note, a messenger carrying a secret that will change everything, walking toward the cockpit where the captain waits. The aircraft did not descend. Instead, it banked slowly, a leviathan of steel and aluminum tracing a wide, monotonous circle over the dark waters of Puget Sound. For nearly 2 hours, the Boeing 727 held this pattern, a ghost ship suspended in the wet gloom of a Pacific Northwest evening. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with a manufactured calm. The captain had spoken over the intercom, his voice steady, reassuring the passengers that a minor mechanical difficulty was keeping them aloft, a simple technical issue that required them to burn off fuel before landing. It was a lie, constructed to keep the pulse of the cabin low, to prevent panic from rippling through the rows of seats. Outside the oval windows, the lights of Seattle were smeared by the mist, distant constellations of amber and white that offered no comfort. Rain lashed against the fuselage, a rhythmic drumming that underscored the tension in the cockpit. In the rear of the plane, the man in seat 18 remained an island of stillness. He did not check his watch. He did not pace. He simply sat, nursing a bourbon and soda, the ice melting slowly in the glass. He wore his dark sunglasses despite the dim cabin lights, his face unreadable, his breathing even. To the flight attendant, Tina, he was polite, almost courtly, yet his demands were absolute. He was waiting for the ground to catch up to him. Below the circling plane, the city was in a frantic, silent scramble. At the Seattle First National Bank, the request had come down with the weight of an ultimatum. The vault was opened, the heavy steel door swinging back to reveal the quiet sanctity of the reserves. Hands moved with urgency, counting out the ransom. It was not a single stack, but a mountain of currency. 10,000 individual bills. $20 notes, chosen for their commonality, their ability to dissolve into the economy without a trace. The bank employees worked fast, assembling the cash into a bundle that weighed roughly 19 pounds. It was heavy, dense with the smell of old paper and ink. They placed the money into a plain bag, a nondescript container for a fortune. Meanwhile, in the damp chill of the evening, a different procurement was underway. A car sped toward the airport, carrying 4 parachutes sourced from a local skydiving center and a stunt pilot. These were not uniform military equipment, but a mix of civilian gear, 2 backpacks and 2 chest packs. The nylon fabric was cold to the touch, packed tight, waiting to be deployed. The authorities on the ground were assembling a puzzle in the dark, gathering the pieces demanded by the man in the sky, driven by the fear of the explosive device resting in a briefcase thousands of feet above their heads. At last, the command came. The pilot guided the aircraft out of its holding pattern, the nose dipping toward the black horizon. The passengers felt the shift in gravity, the descent bringing a collective sigh of relief, unaware of the armed agents positioning themselves in the shadows of the tarmac below. The wheels kissed the wet runway at 5:46 in the evening. Spray hissed from the tires as the heavy machine slowed, taxiing not to the bustling terminal gates, but to a remote, isolated stretch of pavement. The area was brightly lit by portable floodlights, carving a stage out of the night. Cooper had dictated the terms of this arrival with the precision of a director. He demanded that the window shades be drawn, a curtain pulled against the prying eyes of snipers who might be lying prone on the wet grass. The cabin became a sealed tube, the world outside reduced to the muffled roar of jet engines and the sound of rain. Inside, the passengers remained seated, told to keep their heads down, to wait. The silence was heavy, pressurized. The aircraft sat alone on the tarmac, a metal island surrounded by a sea of darkness and rain-slicked concrete. The exchange began with a single figure approaching the plane. Al Lee, the airline's operations manager, walked across the tarmac. He was alone. He carried the heavy bag of money and the bulky parachutes, struggling slightly against the wind and the weight. The mobile staircase was rolled to the forward door, the metal steps slick with rain. Inside, Tina received the instructions. She was to be the courier, the bridge between the hijacker and the world. She walked to the door, the cool, damp air hitting her face, smelling of kerosene and ozone. She descended the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took the money first. The canvas bag was heavy, an awkward burden that she hauled up the steps, her breath pluming in the cold light. She delivered it to the back row, to the man who waited with the patience of a stone. Then she returned to the wet stairs for the parachutes. One by one, she carried them up. The nylon packs were cumbersome, their straps dangling. Cooper inspected them briefly, his gloved hands brushing over the rip cords and the harnesses. He was satisfied. The transaction was complete. The fuel truck, a massive tanker, rumbled toward the wing, its hose ready to feed the thirsty engines for the next leg of a journey only one man understood. With the ransom secured and the parachutes piled on the seat beside him, Cooper gave the nod. The passengers could go. A wave of confusion and immense relief washed over the cabin as they were told to unbuckle. They stood up, gathering their coats and bags, moving toward the front exit with hesitant steps. They walked out into the cool night air, descending the stairs to the tarmac, unaware until that very moment that they had been hostages in a high-stakes negotiation. 36 souls vanished into the safety of the terminal buses, leaving the plane hollow. The cabin was suddenly vast, empty of the murmur of voices and the rustle of clothing. Only the crew remained, 4 of them. The pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and Tina. The door was pulled shut again, sealing them in with the man in the rear. The air grew still. The hum of the auxiliary power unit was the only sound, a constant, low vibration that rattled the floorboards. The plane was lighter now, unburdened by the passengers, but the atmosphere was heavier than ever. Cooper sat amidst the empty rows, the money bag at his feet, the parachutes waiting like silent passengers. He was no longer just a traveler. He was the captain of this vessel, and he was preparing to chart a course into the void. The cabin was suddenly vast. Minutes earlier, it had been filled with the nervous humidity of 36 passengers, the murmur of confusion, and the rustle of winter coats. Now, the Boeing 727 was a hollow tube of silence. The air grew still, settling into the upholstery. Outside the oval windows, the Seattle night was weeping. Rain lashed against the plexiglass in sheets, blurring the tarmac lights into smeared streaks of orange and white. The fueling trucks whined in the distance, a high-pitched mechanical drone that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside, the man in the dark suit sat alone in the rear, surrounded by emptiness. On the seat beside him lay the canvas bag of ransom money and the parachutes, piled like compliant ghosts. Tina Mucklow, the young flight attendant, remained. She was the tether between the man in the rear and the pilots in the cockpit. He beckoned her over, his voice low and unhurried. He did not speak like a desperate criminal. He spoke like a man reading a technical manual. He dictated the flight plan with a precision that chilled the air. He wanted them to fly south, toward Mexico City, but it was the configuration that mattered. He ordered the landing gear to remain deployed, hanging heavy beneath the wings. He wanted the wing flaps set to 15 degrees, and most importantly, the cabin was to remain unpressurized. He was turning the sleek jetliner into a slow, low-flying vessel, breathing the same thin air as the storm outside. Then came the request that halted the preparations. He pointed to the rear of the aircraft, to the heavy door in the floor that led to the aft stairs. He wanted the plane to take off with those stairs extended, open to the rushing wind. Mucklow relayed the message to the cockpit. Captain Scott's voice came back sharp with concern. It was impossible. Taking off with the stairs down risked damaging the aircraft. The rear could scrape the runway upon rotation. When Mucklow returned with the refusal, the man did not rage. He simply nodded, absorbing the information with a calculator's cold logic. He conceded. The stairs would remain up for takeoff, but he would lower them himself once they were airborne. "It can be done," he said. "Do it." He asked Mucklow to show him the mechanism. They stood together in the dim light of the galley, staring at the heavy handle of the aft door. It was a simple lever, industrial and cold to the touch. She explained the operation, how to turn the handle, how the stairs would unlock and drop into the void. It was a surreal lesson, a flight attendant instructing a hijacker on how to breach the safety of the aircraft. He watched her hands, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, memorizing the motion. He seemed to know the machine better than he let on, but he let her speak, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the roof above their heads. The fueling was complete. The smell of kerosene grew heavy, seeping into the cabin air. It was time. The man turned to Mucklow one last time. His instructions were final. She was to go to the cockpit and close the heavy curtain that separated first class from the coach section. She was not to return. No one was to come out. As she turned to leave, she glanced back. The man was standing in the aisle, the fabric of his suit absorbing the shadows. He was wrapping the straps of the money bag around his waist, securing the fortune against his body. He looked like a shadow preparing to merge with the night. She walked away, the carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps, and closed the curtain. The snap of the fabric hooks was the final sound of human contact. At 7:40 in the evening, the engines roared to life. But this was not the sharp, piercing scream of a normal takeoff. With the landing gear dragging in the wind and the flaps extended, the plane shuddered, fighting the air. It lumbered down the runway, heavy and resistant. Inside the main cabin, it was pitch black. Cooper had ordered the lights extinguished to hide his movements from any snipers outside. He sat in the absolute dark, feeling the G-force press him into the seat as the nose lifted. The wheels left the ground, but they did not retract. The thud and clunk of the gear doors closing never came. The plane simply climbed, slow and groaning, rising into the wet, freezing embrace of the clouds. Behind the cockpit curtain, the crew was safe in the light. But in the belly of the plane, D.B. Cooper was alone. The aircraft did not slice through the sky. It waded through it. With the heavy landing gear dragging in the wind and the wing flaps set to 15 degrees, the Boeing 727 shuddered with a constant, rhythmic vibration. It was a sensation of resistance, of a machine fighting to stay aloft while being pulled back by its own drag. Inside the cabin, the air grew steady and thick. The familiar hum of commercial flight was replaced by a lower, guttural groaning of metal straining against the slipstream. At 10,000 feet, they were flying low enough to be part of the weather, not above it. The storm that had battered the airport was now all around them, a suffocating blanket of moisture and turbulence that wrapped the fuselage in grays and blacks. In the rear of the plane, the man known as Dan Cooper was entirely alone. The stewardess had retreated to the safety of the cockpit, leaving the long, narrow aisles stretching out before him like a tunnel. He stood in the dim light, the cabin lights dimmed to prevent reflection, casting long, hollow shadows across the rows of empty seats. He moved with a deliberate, eerie calm. There was no frantic energy, no panic. He was a man folding a newspaper, not a man preparing to vanish. He took the heavy canvas bank bag, the weight of $200,000 pulling at his wrist, and secured it to his body. He likely used the cords from the parachute he had dismantled, winding them tight, testing the knots with gloved fingers. The fabric of the military parachute harness was stiff and rough against his suit, the nylon straps digging into the fine material of his trench coat. He checked the buckles. Click, pull, secure. The temperature in the cabin began to plummet. Even with the door still closed, the cold of the upper atmosphere was bleeding through the seals, a phantom chill that prickled the skin. He turned toward the aft pressure door. This was the threshold. Beyond it lay the staircase, and beyond that the void. He reached out and turned the handle. The seal broke with a sharp hiss, instantly drowned out by a deafening roar. The sound was physical, a wall of noise that slammed into the cabin. It was the sound of 170 knots of wind tearing past the opening. The air that rushed in was not just cold. It was freezing, carrying the metallic taste of ozone and the wet, earthy scent of the storm clouds. Papers on the nearby seats fluttered violently, then were sucked backward into the dark maw. He stepped into the small vestibule at the rear. The noise was absolute now, erasing all thought. He found the control handle for the air stair and pulled. The hydraulics whined, fighting the wind, but gravity took over. The floor beneath his feet opened up. The stairs dropped, but they did not lock into place. The sheer force of the slipstream pushed them back up, keeping them floating, semi-retracted, bouncing on a cushion of rushing air. To descend, he had to force them down with his own weight. He placed a loafer on the first step. The metal was slick with condensation. He took another step. The stairs groaned and dipped under him. He was now standing outside the protection of the fuselage, suspended in the black belly of the night. Below him, there were no lights, no cities, no highways, just the impenetrable darkness of the Lewis River Basin and the vast, sleeping forests of the Pacific Northwest. Rain lashed at his face, stinging like needles. The wind chill was far below freezing, instantly numbing exposed skin. His trench coat whipped violently around his legs, snapping in the gale. He held the handrail, the metal freezing cold through his gloves. He looked down into the abyss. There was no horizon, no up or down, only the roaring blackness. The time was approximately 8:13 in the evening. The aircraft was passing through the storm clouds, completely blind. Cooper did not hesitate. He did not look back at the warmth of the cabin he was leaving. He simply let go. He stepped off the last rung of the ladder and surrendered to the gravity of the earth. In the cockpit, the crew felt it instantly. It was not a sound, but a physical sensation, a sudden, sharp popping in their ears, like a champagne cork continuously pulled. The air pressure in the cabin fluctuated wildly. The nose of the plane dipped slightly, then corrected. The pilots felt a distinctive bump, an oscillation that traveled through the spine of the aircraft. The air stair, suddenly relieved of the man's weight, had sprung upward, slammed back by the wind, before bouncing down again. The red light on the instrument panel glared, unblinking. They called out over the intercom, asking if he needed help. Static was the only reply. In the back, the wind howled through the open hole, swirling through the empty rows, chilling the air until it matched the freezing night outside. The man was gone. He had fallen into the freezing rain, tumbling toward the tree tops of the Washington wilderness, taking his secrets with him into the black night. The aircraft shuddered, a long, metallic groan vibrating through the fuselage as the air pressure equalized. In the cockpit, the pilots fought the controls, correcting the sudden upward pitch. The oscillation settled, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had irrevocably changed. A frigid gale now roared through the open aft staircase, sucking the warmth out of the plane and replacing it with the thin, biting air of 10,000 feet. The temperature plummeted, frost forming instantly on the edges of the open hatch, a jagged white border against the consuming blackness of the night sky. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the relentless rushing wind. The stewardess, huddled in the cockpit, waited for a signal, a sound, anything to indicate the man in the dark suit was still there. But the intercom remained dead. The cabin behind them was a ghost ship, carrying nothing but empty seats and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. Flight 305 descended toward Reno, a wounded bird limping home. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, but the rear air stairs remained extended, locking the aircraft in a strange, ungainly configuration. As the wheels touched the tarmac, a shower of sparks erupted beneath the tail, the metal of the staircase grinding against the concrete runway in a violent spray of orange light. The plane taxied to a halt, surrounded immediately by a sea of flashing red and blue lights. Law enforcement agents, weapons drawn, crouched behind cruisers, waiting for a movement that never came. The captain eventually emerged, his face pale under the airport floodlights. He confirmed what the silence had already suggested. The cabin was empty. The man was gone. All that remained were a few cigarette butts, a black clip-on tie from JC, Penny and 2 parachutes. The hunt was on. The investigation was christened Operation NORJAK, a clipped military shorthand for Northwest hijacking. It would become one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. The focus shifted instantly from the high desert of Nevada back to the dense, rain-soaked wilderness of southwest Washington. Based on the flight path and the timing of the pressure bump, the search area was narrowed to a rugged sector near Ariel and Lake Merwin. It was a landscape of unforgiving terrain, a tapestry of Douglas firs and ravines that could swallow a man whole and never give him back. The federal agents and local deputies who converged on the area were met not just by the vastness of the woods, but by the fury of the elements. The gentle mist of the lowlands had curdled into a brutal winter storm, turning the forest into a freezing, waterlogged labyrinth. By Thanksgiving morning, a small army had assembled. 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis, along with National Guard troops and civilian volunteers, lined up at the edge of the tree line. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine needles and diesel exhaust from the transport trucks. The rain did not fall so much as it was driven into them, sheets of icy water that found every gap in their ponchos. The ground was a slurry of mud and decaying vegetation, sucking at their boots with every step. They moved in grid formations, a slow, human wave combing through the underbrush. Eyes scanned the forest floor for a splash of color, the red or white of a parachute canopy, the dark shape of a suit jacket, or the green canvas of a money bag. But the woods offered nothing but shadows. The fern fronds, heavy with water, brushed against their legs like wet fingers, and the canopy above dripped incessantly, a rhythmic, maddening cadence that blurred the line between the sound of the storm and the sound of movement. Overhead, helicopters sliced through the gray sky, their rotors beating the heavy air. Pilots strained to see through the rain-streaked plexiglass, searching for broken branches or signs of impact in the tall timber. The downdraft from the blades flattened the tall grass in the clearings, revealing only more mud and gray stone. Down below, the searchers were cold, their hands numb despite their gloves. They poked at piles of wet leaves with sticks, overturning rot and fungus, hoping to uncover a footprint. But the earth was fluid, shifting and sliding under the deluge. Any mark a man might have made upon landing would have been washed away hours ago, dissolved into the chaotic runoff that streamed down the ravines toward the Lewis River. The forest felt ancient and indifferent, a silent witness that refused to testify. As the light began to fail on that first long day of searching, the temperature dropped further. The rain turned to sleet, rattling against the helmets of the soldiers like gravel. The sheer scale of the wilderness began to settle in on them. They were looking for a single man in miles of dense, vertical terrain, in weather that could kill an exposed traveler in a matter of hours. If he had landed in the trees, he might be hanging above them, shrouded in the canopy. If he had landed in the water, the deep, dark expanse of Lake Merwin held its secrets tight. The dogs picked up no scent in the washing rain. The technology of the era, the sheer manpower, the desperate energy of the pursuit, all of it seemed small against the backdrop of the storm. Operation NORJAK had begun with a roar of engines and the shout of orders. But out here, in the deep woods, it was being swallowed by the quiet, relentless power of the winter night. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. In a small, stark room in Minneapolis, the air smelled of stale tobacco smoke and the sharp, chemical tang of fresh coffee. It was just days after the jump. November 26, 1971. The world outside was beginning to churn with the mystery, but inside this room, the atmosphere was quiet, clinical, and heavy with memory. FBI sketch artist Roy Rose sat at a drafting table, his hand hovering over a sheet of high-quality paper. Across from him sat the women who had looked the ghost in the face. Florence Schaffner, Tina Mucklow, Alice Hancock. They were tired. Their eyes were rimmed with the redness of sleepless nights, their uniforms replaced by civilian clothes that felt strange and loose on their bodies. They were safe, yet they were still trapped in the cabin of Flight 305. The pencil touched the paper. A soft, scratching sound, like a dry leaf skittering across pavement. Rose was a master of listening, of translating hesitant words into graphite lines. He asked them to close their eyes, to drift back to the aisle seat in the last row. He needed the shape of a jaw, the width of a forehead. The women spoke in fragments. One remembered the way his hair was combed back, slick and dark, parting on the left. Another recalled the ears, average and unmemorable. They struggled with the nose. Was it broad? Was it thin? It was a face designed to be forgotten, a landscape of beige normalcy. As the image began to form, a strange familiarity emerged. It was not the face of a monster. It was the face of a neighbor, an accountant, a man you might pass in a grocery aisle without a second glance. Someone whispered that he looked like the singer Bing Crosby. The comparison hung in the air, absurd and unsettling. A crooner's soft face hiding a bomb. Then came the defining feature, the barrier between the man and the world, the sunglasses. For most of the flight, he had worn them, shielding his intent. Roy Rose darkened the paper, filling in the large, rectangular frames. They were not just black. Witnesses remembered a tint, a russet or amber hue that caught the cabin light, turning his gaze into a smoky impenetrability. Florence was the only one who had truly seen what lay beneath. She had looked him in the eye before the glasses went on. She remembered them as dark, possibly brown, intelligent and calm. But for the sketch, for the image that would soon be plastered on every post office wall in America, the eyes were hidden. The artist pressed harder on the paper, creating the void. The man in the sketch became a blank slate, an observer who could see out, but whom no one could see in. The addition of the glasses transformed the drawing from a portrait of a person into the icon of a phantom. While the face was being reconstructed in Minneapolis, the name was being rewritten in Oregon. The manhunt was chaotic. In the rush to identify the suspect, police in Portland were scouring their files for anyone with the surname Cooper. They pulled the file of a local man, a minor offender with a record that had nothing to do with skyjacking. His name was D.B. Cooper. He was quickly cleared, a dead end in a maze of leads. But in the fever of the newsroom, a mistake occurred. A reporter for the Oregon Journal, perhaps racing against the relentless ticking of a deadline, or maybe mishearing a crackling voice over the telephone, confused the suspect with the hijacker. The man on the plane had signed his ticket as Dan Cooper. A simple, flat name, but the reporter's notes merged the two. The teletype machines began to clatter, punching the error into the wire services. United Press International picked up the story. The keys of the teletypes hammered out the new moniker, D.B. Cooper. It flashed across the country, printed in the morning editions of newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. The name Dan Cooper felt plain, terrestrial, but D.B. Cooper, it had a rhythm. It sounded mysterious, official, like a secret agent or a wealthy executive gone rogue. The public latched onto it instantly. By the time the mistake was realized, it was too late to correct. The ink was dry. The legend had been baptized. The man who jumped into the storm was no longer just a hijacker. He was D.B. Cooper. The name gave him a persona that Dan never had. It polished the edges of the crime, turning a dangerous felony into a sleek piece of folklore. Back in the interview room, the sketch was finished. The women looked at the piece of paper. It was him, and yet it was not him. It was the memory of fear captured in gray light. This drawing, known as Composite B, would become one of the most famous images in criminal history. It would be printed on millions of flyers. It would stare out from television screens and newspapers for decades. People would see that face in their neighbors, their uncles, their coworkers. They would call the FBI, whispering that they knew the man in the dark glasses. But the man himself was gone. He had vanished not just into the forest, but into the static of the media age. The sketch remained, a mask floating in the collective consciousness, watching, waiting, forever calm, forever unknown. The interrogation room door had closed, leaving the sketch on the table, but the true hunt was already expanding far beyond those four walls. It moved out into the world, invisible and pervasive, carried not by agents in suits, but by paper. Thousands of sheets of paper. Before the money had ever left the ground in Seattle, before it was packed into the canvas bag and handed over to the man in the dark sunglasses, it had been catalogued. A frantic, silent effort by bank clerks in a secure room, their hands moving in a blur as they photographed each bill on microfilm. 10,000 notes, 10,000 distinct identities, now etched into the permanent memory of the Bureau. Now, that memory was being weaponized. The Federal Bureau of Investigation compiled these ghosts into a document. It was a booklet, 34 pages long, dense with columns of alphanumeric codes. To the uninitiated, it looked like a cipher, a wall of meaningless data. But to the hunters, it was a map. The list contained the serial numbers of every single $20 bill given to the hijacker. Most of them began with the letter L, marking them as children of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. They were series 1969 and 1963, a crisp, green, and somewhere out there in the wind. The Bureau printed thousands of these booklets, stuffing them into thick manila envelopes, and sent them out in a massive wave that washed over the financial arteries of the world. They arrived first at the banks. Picture a quiet Tuesday morning in a small branch in rural Oregon. The air smells of floor wax and old copper pennies. The fluorescent lights hum with a low, insect-like buzz overhead. A teller, perhaps a young woman named Margaret, opens the envelope. She pulls out the 34-page booklet. It feels heavy, substantial. Her manager tells her that every $20 bill that crosses her counter must be checked. She nods, sliding the booklet next to her drawer. And then the first customer arrives. A rancher with dirt under his fingernails, depositing a stack of cash from a hay sale. Margaret takes the money. The texture is familiar. The cotton linen blend of American currency, soft and fibrous. She picks up the first 20. She looks at the serial number in the corner. She looks down at the booklet. Her finger traces the first column on page 1. It is a slow, agonizing process. L124, no. She checks the next bill. L567, no. The line behind the rancher grows. A man in a gray coat checks his watch. A mother hushes a crying baby. Margaret feels the heat rising in her cheeks. The booklet is a labyrinth, 10,000 numbers. The human eye begins to swim after the 50th check. The numbers detach from the paper, floating in a sea of gray ink. By the afternoon, the booklet has been pushed slightly to the side. By the end of the week, it sits on a shelf in the back, gathering a fine layer of dust. The hunt extended to the places where money moves fastest. The casinos of Reno and Las Vegas. Here, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no quiet hum of fluorescent lights, only the cacophony of slot machines, the clatter of dice, and the roar of 1,000 conversations merging into a single ocean of sound. The pit bosses and cage cashiers were given the same 34-page list. But here, money was not a stored commodity, it was water. It flowed in torrents. A high roller would dump a brick of 20s on the velvet counter, demanding chips. The cashier would look at the stack, then at the booklet. To check them all would take an hour. The game could not stop. The house could not wait. The list was glanced at, perhaps for a day or two, but the sheer velocity of greed outpaced the patience of justice. Weeks turned into months. The envelopes containing the serial numbers traveled even further, crossing oceans to Scotland Yard, to banks in Zurich and Tokyo, to racetracks where desperate men bet their last crumpled notes on a long shot. The world was looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack was the entire global economy. Every time a $20 bill was handed from a gas station attendant to a truck driver, or slipped into a birthday card, or tucked under a mattress, it carried the potential to break the case. But the silence remained absolute. Not a single match triggered the alarm. The bills had simply vanished, as if they had dematerialized the moment they left the plane, dissolving into the cold night air just like the man who held them. But while the world looked up at the sky, tracing flight paths and parachutes, the answer was waiting in the mud. It lay buried in the cold, wet silence of the earth, patient and rotting. We move forward now, 9 years after the jump. It is February 10th, 1980. The location is a quiet stretch of beachfront known as Tina Bar, sitting on the edge of the Columbia River. The river here is wide and muscular, a gray vein pulsing through the landscape of Washington state. It is a place of shifting sands and cold currents, where the water eats away at the bank and deposits the debris of 1,000 miles upstream. On this particular Sunday, the air is crisp, carrying the biting scent of winter river water and damp pine. The sky is a flat, unmoving sheet of slate. It is not a day for high drama or criminal chases. It is a day for families, for picnics, for the small, unremarkable moments that make up a quiet life. The Ingram family had come to the river to relax. Among them was their son, Brian. He was only 8 years old, a boy with the simple, focused energy of childhood. His task for the afternoon was modest. He wanted to build a campfire. He knelt in the sand, his knees pressing into the damp grains, his small hands working with a plastic rake. He smoothed the earth, preparing a shallow pit where the flames could breathe. The sound of the river was a constant, low roar behind him, a white noise that swallowed the sound of his breathing. He scraped at the ground. The sand at Tina Bar is dense, packed down by rain and the weight of the river during high tides. It resists the rake. Brian dug deeper, his fingers brushing against smooth stones and tangles of driftwood roots. And then his rake struck something that did not feel like stone. It did not clink or grate. It yielded. It was soft, spongy, and buried just a few inches beneath the surface. Curious, he reached down. The sand felt cold and gritty under his fingernails as he pried the object loose. It was heavy for its size, sodden with years of absorbed water. He pulled it up into the gray light of the afternoon. It was a bundle, then another, and a third. They were rectangular, caked in dark mud and sediment, looking less like treasure and more like bricks of decaying organic matter. Brian wiped the grime away, his thumbs smearing the black silt that coated the surface. Beneath the muck, he saw the faint, pale green of paper. He saw the intricate, familiar scrollwork of currency. He stared at it, confused. It looked like money, but it felt wrong. It was heavy, wet pulp, swollen and fragile. He called out to his parents, holding up the rotting brick. At first glance, they thought it must be a joke. Perhaps play money buried by another child, or trash left behind by a careless fisherman. It seemed impossible that real wealth would be left to rot in the sand of a public beach. But as they looked closer, the reality of the find began to settle in. These were $20 bills, hundreds of them. The edges were rounded and worn away by the abrasion of sand and water. The paper was fragile, ready to tear at the slightest rough handling. But miraculously, they were still bound together. Rubber bands, old and brittle, still circled the stacks. In the open air, these bands were on the verge of disintegration. One touch, one shift in pressure, and they would crumble into dust. Yet in the oxygen-deprived tomb of the sand, they had held the bundles tight for nearly a decade. The money smelled of the river, of algae, wet earth, and deep, stagnant time. The top and bottom bills were blackened, almost charcoal-like, protecting the lighter, more legible bills in the center. Brian held in his hands roughly $5,800, but it was not just money. It was a ghost. The authorities were called. The innocent discovery of a boy building a fire pit suddenly became the center of a federal storm. The bills were taken away, treated with the delicacy of archaeological artifacts. Agents and technicians, likely wearing white gloves to protect the disintegrating paper, began the tedious work of separation. They peered at the faded green ink, hunting for the identifiers. They looked for the serial numbers, and there they were. The numbers matched. This was it. This was the ransom. Out of the $200,000 that had vanished into the night sky in 1971, this was the first and only trace ever found. The serial numbers aligned perfectly with the list distributed to banks and casinos years ago. The money had not been spent in a tropical paradise. It had not been laundered through a high-stakes poker game. It had been sleeping in the mud of the Columbia River, slowly turning back into the earth. The discovery at Tina Bar answered one question, but birthed 1,000 more. How did it get there? The location was miles from the supposed drop zone. Had the money fallen from the sky and landed in a tributary, washing down over the years to lodge in this specific sandbank? Had Cooper survived, only to bury a portion of his loot here for safekeeping, never to return? Or had he died in the fall, his body and the bag separated by the violence of the river, leaving the money to drift alone until the currents buried it? Geologists studied the sand layers. Hydrologists studied the river flow. They argued about dredging operations in 1974 that might have moved the earth. But the river offered no testimony. It simply flowed on, indifferent to the mystery it had revealed. The rubber bands crumbled. The money dried out. And the shadow of the man in the suit grew slightly darker, standing silently on the edge of the water, watching the boy dig. The damp sand of Tina Bar held the money like a secret, burying it beneath layers of river silt and time. But while the earth swallowed the ransom, the question of the man himself refused to decay. If the money was there, rotting in the wet dark, where was the hand that once clutched it? To leap into a freezing void at 10,000 feet into the teeth of a storm required more than desperation. It required discipline. It required a mind that could calculate wind speed and trajectory while the world screamed outside the open hatch. As investigators looked past the physical evidence, they began to profile the ghost. They were looking for a soldier. The profile was specific. This was not a panic-stricken amateur. The hijacker had been polite, calm, and methodical. He knew the mechanics of the Boeing 727. He knew the aft stairs could be lowered in flight, a detail not commonly known to the civilian public at the time. This knowledge pointed to a man who had lived in the belly of these machines, or perhaps one who had jumped from them before. The search turned toward those with the wings of a paratrooper, men who had learned to suppress the instinct to freeze when the ground fell away. 4 months after Cooper vanished, a mirror image emerged from the shadows. His name was Richard McCoy, a Vietnam veteran, a Green Beret, a helicopter pilot, and a demolition expert. He did not just resemble the sketch. He embodied the skill set. In April of 1972, McCoy boarded a United Airlines flight in Denver. He wore a disguise, a wig and thick makeup that caked in the creases of his face, but underneath, the soldier's nerves were steel. He handed a note to the crew, demanding $500,000. He held a hand grenade, or what looked like one. The pin pulled, his thumb the only thing preventing the strike lever from snapping. McCoy's crime was a violent echo of the Cooper jump. He commanded the plane to the skies over Utah. The sensory details of his escape paint a vivid picture of what Cooper might have experienced. Imagine the cabin depressurizing, the air growing thin and cold. The sound of the engines would have been a dull roar, suddenly overwhelmed by the chaotic rushing wind as the rear stairs groaned open. McCoy stood on that precipice, the darkness of the Utah desert sprawling infinitely below him. He did not hesitate. He jumped. And unlike the uncertain fate of Cooper, we know McCoy survived the fall. He landed, buried the chute, and walked away with the cash, proving that the impossible leap was, in fact, survivable for a man with the right training. But McCoy was not the only shadow casting a long silhouette over the case. There was another man, one who knew the sensation of falling into danger long before he ever stepped onto a commercial airliner. Sheridan Peterson. He was a smoke jumper, one of the elite few who parachuted into forest fires to battle the flames from within. Peterson was a man of the elements, comfortable in the chaotic swirl of smoke and heat, his body conditioned to absorb the shock of a rough landing on rugged terrain. He had the physical presence, the rugged bone structure that matched the sketches, and something even more incriminating. He worked for Boeing. Peterson walked the halls where the 727 was designed. He knew the technical manuals. He knew the stress tolerances of the aft stairs. He existed at the intersection of intellectual precision and physical daring. Investigators found photos of him simulating skydiving maneuvers for a company newsletter, wearing a suit and tie that eerily mimicked the attire of the hijacker. When questioned, Peterson was charming, elusive, a man who seemed to enjoy the dance of suspicion without ever giving up a step. He was a puzzle piece that fit perfectly, yet the edges never quite locked into place. These men, the Green Beret and the smoke jumper, represented the caliber of adversary the FBI was chasing. They were not common criminals stumbling into a fortune. They were specialists. They understood the alchemy of gravity and wind. They knew how to pack a chute so it would not foul in the turbulence of a jet engine. They knew how to land in the pitch black of a forest without breaking every bone in their bodies. And yet, for all their skills, for all the logic that placed them in the frame, neither could be definitively placed in seat 18E on that rainy November night. They remained specters, capable of the deed, but perhaps not the authors of it. The years drifted by, turning into decades, accumulating like the soft, gray dust on the tops of metal filing cabinets. The chase that had begun in the driving rain of a November night had stretched out until the world itself had changed. The agents who had first run through the mud of the Columbia River banks had grayed and retired, handing their notes to younger men and women who had not even been born when the aft stairs lowered. The file known as NORJAK had grown into a monstrous physical thing, a beast of paper and ink that occupied shelf after shelf in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's headquarters. It was 66 volumes thick, 66 volumes of typed reports, carbon copies, faded photographs, and the desperate, scribbled handwriting of thousands of tips that led nowhere. It smelled of stale coffee and old manila folders, a library of frustration that no amount of modern technology could fully decode. By the summer of 2016, the investigation had become a ghost hunting another ghost. Science had tried its best. The black clip-on tie, left behind on seat 18E, had been subjected to the most advanced scrutiny the 21st century could offer. Electron microscopes had combed through its fibers, finding microscopic particles of unalloyed titanium, bismuth, and aluminum, traces of a high-tech industrial world that suggested the man was an engineer or a manager in a chemical plant. But the particles were just dust. They could not speak. They could not give a name. The partial DNA profile lifted from the tie was too fragmented to point to a single human being with certainty. It was a genetic whisper, too quiet to be heard over the roar of 45 years of silence. And so the decision was made. It did not happen with a bang or a press conference filled with flashing cameras and dramatic revelations. It happened in the quiet, air-conditioned corridors of bureaucracy. It was a Tuesday, July 12, 2016. The decision was administrative, cold, and practical. The Bureau issued a statement, the language dry and stripped of all the mystery that had captivated the world for nearly half a century. They announced that they were redirecting resources to other investigative priorities. The hunt for the man in the dark suit was officially over. The active investigation was suspended. The detectives were being called off the trail, not because they had found the end of it, but because the trail had simply dissolved into the undergrowth, reclaimed by the wild. Imagine the stillness of that moment. A final signature on a piece of paperwork, the closing of a heavy book. For the agents who had lived with the phantom of Cooper for years, it must have felt like a strange surrender. There was no handcuffs, no reading of rights, no triumphant walk to the squad car. Just the realization that the secret was going to remain a secret. The statement noted that the FBI had exhaustively reviewed all credible leads. They had interviewed everyone. They had dug up riverbanks and scanned forests with satellites. But the man was gone. He had jumped into the night and never landed, or at least, he had never landed in a way that the law could touch. The files were to be preserved for historical purposes, sent to the archives to sit alongside the records of other solved and unsolved misdeeds, becoming artifacts rather than evidence. The physical evidence, the few tangible things that proved he existed at all, was packed away into the dark. The pink parachute, the one he had cut from its lines to wrap the money, lay folded in a box, its nylon fabric stiff with age. The black tie, with its pearl-handled tie clip, waited in an evidence locker, a silent witness to a crime it could not solve. And the money, the few rotting bundles of $20 bills found on the sandbar in 1980, remained the only trace of the loot ever recovered. The rest of the cash, thousands upon thousands of bills, was likely dissolved into pulp by the elements, or perhaps spent in quiet corners of the world where no one checked serial numbers. The closure was absolute. Unless someone walked into a field office with the specific parachutes or the specific money, the doors were shut. The mystery had outlasted the pursuit. In the end, the forest kept its secret. The sheer volume of time had provided the perfect cover. As the files were boxed and the digital records archived, the legend of Dan Cooper separated fully from the reality of the investigation. He was no longer a fugitive to be caught. He was a story to be told. The silence of the Washington wilderness, where he had leaped into the freezing void, remained unbroken. The wind still moved through the tops of the Douglas firs, whispering over the rough terrain where he might have walked, or where he might have fallen. The case was closed, leaving behind only the rhythmic sound of rain falling on the canopy, washing away the last footprints of a ghost. The forest has a way of keeping what belongs to it. In the deep, moss-choked ravines of the Pacific Northwest, time moves differently. It drips from the canopy in heavy, rhythmic sheets, soaking into the earth until the soil becomes a sponge, swallowing sound, swallowing history. Here, the Douglas firs stand like sentinels, their bark rough and damp, smelling of resin and centuries of silence. If you walk far enough into these woods, the modern world falls away. The hum of the highway fades, replaced by the wind moving through millions of needles, a sound like a vast, collective breath. It was into this green, indifferent cathedral that the man we call Cooper vanished. He did not just jump from a plane. He jumped out of reality and into myth. For decades, agents and amateurs alike scoured this landscape, turning over stones, dredging riverbeds, and staring into the thickets, hoping for a glint of metal or a scrap of cloth. But the wilderness offered nothing but its own cold beauty. The silence was broken only once, 9 years after the jump, on a cold Sunday in February 1980. It happened at a place called Tina Bar, a lonely stretch of sand along the Columbia River. A young boy, just 8 years old, was smoothing the earth to build a campfire. His fingers, cold and red from the winter air, raked through the coarse grains. He wasn't looking for treasure. He was simply playing in the dirt, as children do. But then his hand struck something odd, not a stone, not a piece of driftwood, but a bundle. It was heavy, sodden, and strange. As he pulled it from the sand, the object seemed to disintegrate in his grip. It was money. 3 bundles of $20 bills, their edges rounded by water and time, their paper turned to a fragile, rotting pulp. The rubber bands that had once held them tight crumbled at the lightest touch, dissolving into dust. The river had chewed on the ransom, digesting it slowly, before spitting this small fraction back onto the bank. It was the only physical greeting Cooper ever sent back to the living world. That discovery ignited a spark, a brief flare of excitement that the answers were close. But the river, like the forest, guarded its secrets jealously. Geologists studied the sand layers, trying to determine when the money had arrived, how long it had floated, and where it had come from. They spoke of dredging operations and currents, of diatoms and sediment. Yet, every answer just birthed a new question. Was the money buried by human hands, or had it tumbled down from some upstream grave? The bills were verified by their serial numbers, ghosts of the transaction made on that rainy Thanksgiving Eve. But they stood alone. No parachute was found nearby. No briefcase. No bones. The evidence was merely a taunt, a reminder that the elements eventually reclaim everything. The years dragged on, stretching into decades. The files in the Federal Bureau of Investigation grew thick and dusty, filling with thousands of leads that circled endlessly back to nowhere. The agents who had started the chase retired, their hair turning gray, the mystery remaining as fresh and insolent as it was on day one. Finally, the inevitable administrative end arrived. It was July 2016. 45 years had passed since the aft stairs lowered into the storm. The Bureau released a statement, clinical and dry, announcing that the active investigation was being suspended. The resources, they said, were needed for more pressing, modern crimes. There would be no more official searches, no more analyzing soil samples or chasing down deathbed confessions. The file was closed, not with a bang, but with a quiet resignation. In the eyes of the law, the case of D.B. Cooper became a historical footnote, an unsolved puzzle left on the shelf. But in the public imagination, this official end only solidified the legend. By closing the book, they ensured that the story would never truly finish. Cooper was no longer a fugitive to be caught. He was a permanent question mark, a phantom who had successfully cheated the system, the sky, and perhaps even death itself. Now the Pacific Northwest sleeps under the same heavy clouds. The rain still falls on the Columbia River, pockmarking the surface of the gray water. The wind still howls through the gorge, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Somewhere out there, perhaps buried beneath a layer of needles and loam, or scattered by the currents of the river, the truth remains. It is peaceful there. The urgency of the manhunt has evaporated. The noise of the theories has quieted down to a whisper. We are left with the image of a man in a dark suit, stepping off the edge of the known world and falling into the dark. He belongs to the air now. He belongs to the pines. The mystery is his final purchase, bought with $20 bills and a leap of faith. We can stop searching. We can let the forest keep what it has won. The case rests now, Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.